on the air. Sorry, anyone that's listening. We love you, and we're glad that you joined the class.
want to say again, thanks. Good to see everybody here this evening. We left off last week. We looked at 2,000 years of church history, and then the second session we looked at basically the last 100 years of church history of the Pentecostal movement. We're going to back up just a little bit tonight and back up into the Reformation some. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Baptist history tonight in order to set a framework. We looked at our Pentecostal background of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and now I want to look at our Baptist background of the Church of God Mountain Assembly in order to understand the organization that became the Church of God Mountain Assembly. It's so important to understand our Baptist roots, our Baptist background. And I hope that, certainly, I hope that by the time I'm done tonight, you'll see that more clearly. And maybe even by the time the course is finished, it will become even clearer. Let me say this. Here's my thesis. When I write my next book, and I redo the history of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and I'm talking about redoing the academic work that I did. When I redo it, this is where my thesis is. You will not understand the Church of God Mountain Assembly without understanding it. A little bit last week about 2,000 years of church history, and we said very little, if any, about Baptists themselves, and yet certainly in our area, you can't tell the story of the church without telling the story of Baptists. When they say we're in the Bible Belt, well, we're in the Baptist Belt. And so let's talk about Baptist origins. And I want us to consider, we're going to talk about theories on Baptist origins. And we're going to look at 4 theories that historians, when they talk about where Baptists came from, when they talk about the history of the Baptist movement, they're basically 4 theories about where Baptists came from. And the first one of those is what I'm going to call Baptist successionism. And this is a view that's held by many Baptists, and it just simply says that there has always been a Baptist church since the time of Christ. That the Baptist church was separate from the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, and that it ran parallel in history throughout time, that the succession of the church in Baptist churches has been passed down from the age of the apostles until now. And so that's what is meant by the phrase Baptist successionism. There's also a theory that's very similar to that, and sometimes you see them talked about side by side. Sometimes sometimes they're almost used interchangeably, but I'm differentiating the two of them, and I'll specify what I mean by that in just a second. But the second is Baptist perpetuity. So one is Baptist successionism, and the other is Baptist perpetuity. And so it's very similar to the first. The first theory is that there's always been a Baptist church, that there's always been Baptist churches since the time of the apostles. They passed down from one generation to the next. The second is Baptist perpetuity, and that is that Baptist faith and Baptist practice has always been since the time of Christ. Now the difference is Baptist succession says there's been a Baptist church since the time of Christ. Baptist perpetuity recognizes there wasn't a Baptist church, but there was Baptist thought and Baptist practice. So that there were people that were operating, they wouldn't call those congregations or the individual Christians who believed like Baptists, who practiced like Baptists, have been since the time of Christ. Gary, do you have a...
Just basically going to say point blank successionism is there was a Baptist church. Perpetuity is that this is what the Baptists taught and believed.
Yes, and belief and practice. That there have always been. The difference is Baptist successionism, the church, the Baptist church has existed since the time of Christ. John the Baptist is their founder, their forerunner. And there has been a church side by side, simultaneous with the church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and Baptist perpetuity says, well, we wouldn't go so far as to suggest that there's been a Baptist church, but there has been, that Baptist thought, that Baptist practice has existed since the time of Christ. Now, this theory, Baptist perpetuity, and to some degree, Baptist historians have leaned on it, have leaned on this work, was launched by James Milton Carroll in his pamphlet, The Trail of Blood. There's a pamphlet, a little leaflet series or booklet, if you will, The Trail of Blood, that claims that that claims a descent by modern Baptists from earlier groups such as the Waldensians, the Cathari, the Paulicians, and the Donatists, that these groups that have existed in church history throughout that while they might not have worn the label Baptist, that the Baptist movement is related to, so that the Waldensians, for example, might not have called themselves Baptists, but in thought or in practice, they were very, very Baptist by it. Now, I know I've thrown some terms out there that maybe you're not familiar with, and so let me go back. The Waldensians, Waldensians, the Waldensians. See, there's always been Waldens as long as we can go back. Actually, the Waldensians were led by a man by the name of Peter Waldo, who renounced his wealth. The focus was on lay preaching rather than on a trained bishopric or a priesthood. He preached a strict adherence to the Bible, and so he had a lot of followers that gave creed to his teaching. The Cathari are a group that also, and I wished I had, I thought I had in my notes time frames for each of these. You have to look them up. Cathari, or just Cathars, if you're not looking at the plural for the group name themselves. Basically, they're anti-sacerdotal. Now, there's another $2 word for you, too. The idea is, we talk about the sacraments. In the Catholic position, a sacrament is necessary and is effective towards salvation. That baptism is important. It's an important part of salvation. It has a sacerdotal effect. The Cathari said that the sacraments were not, they thought of them as being more along the lines of an ordinance rather than a sacrament. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And they said there's only one sacrament, and that is the last rite, one sacrament that purges us from all of our sins. And they typically administered it prior to death. Paulicians were a dualistic group that rejected the Old Testament and even parts of the New Testament. The Donatists argued that the priests must be faultless in order for their sacraments to be effective. The idea was, how can priests who are not sinless, how can priests who in some cases are just totally immoral? I mean, we're not taking us, slamming the Catholic Church, but the truth of the matter is, there have been priests that you wouldn't call them their lifestyle Christian by any stretch of imagination, some of the things that they've done. And so the Donatists said, well, they've got how can their work, their sacrament, how can what they do on your behalf be effective if it's done by somebody who's not even living right? Did you have a comment?
Yeah, did you say the Paulicians?
Paulicians, yeah.
Okay. What was the criteria that they were cutting out from that? Like, you said they were cutting out the Old Testament and parts of the New Testament. Was it like a Gnostic kind of thing?
Basically, the focus was on the writings of Paul. Now, that not to the total exclusion against the name. And they felt we're devotees of Paul. And in Baptist thought, it's the idea of salvation by grace through faith And and that's why they will claim them as ancestors. And so that's what we see in these ideas of Baptist successionism and Baptist perpetuity. Now let me just say this. When historians do religious history and what have you, the only people who have ever bought into either one of these theories are Baptists. All right? And that's not a slam or anything, but that's just how it is. Baptist historians tend to buy into the idea of successionism or perpetuity, but more than any other serious academic would in dealing with with origins and with history. A third theory on Baptist origin that is popular among Baptists and other historians is the influence of Anabaptists. The Anabaptist influence. Anabaptist just simply means a rebaptizer. Now, I ask you, in the traditional church, in the Roman Catholic Church or in the Greek Orthodox Church, when is baptism typically performed?
Infancy.
As infants. They baptize them as infants. They become a part of the church shortly after their birth. They're christened and taken into the church. And again, in Catholic doctrine, in Orthodox doctrine, the sacrament of baptism is effective and necessary for that salvation. Anabaptizers, in the 15th and 16th century, began to teach and believe that baptism is only valid when the candidate professes faith in Christ. Sometimes it's called believer's baptism. That somebody has to make a profession of faith. That baptism is only effective when they're able to actually make that. And so in many traditions, some of the more common Anabaptists that we're familiar with are the Mennonites, the Amish. Some of these that get grouped into some of the first Anabaptists were those that recognize, as adults, that begin to rebaptize. Now that I have come to an understanding and have a personal relationship with Christ or whatever it was, I'm able to make a profession of faith on my own, and so they were being rebaptized. And so many scholars believe that the Baptist that the Baptist churches grew out of this tradition, grew out of this influence. And then one fourth theory that I want to look at, and this is the theory that most scholars accept, is that the Baptist church grew out of the Protestant Reformation, that it grew out of Anglican, in particular, Anglican separatism. And I want to just mention real quickly, I think in the first session we talked just a little bit about the Church of England, that basically Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce because his wife wouldn't give him a son, and the Pope would not grant him a divorce, would not allow it, so you don't have cause for divorce. And so instead he decided, well, you know what, everybody else is protesting, everybody else is rejecting the church, we'll just start our own. And so the Church of England was launched as a protest against the Roman Catholic Church. And in the Anglican Church, with the Archbishop of Canterbury becoming the head of the church, the Anglican Church came into existence as a result of that. Within that Anglican tradition, there were those who wanted to purify the church against what they said. You know what? They said, we're Protestant, yes, I get that, but we're not Protestant enough. There were those that were saying, we're still too Catholic. We need to make some changes within our church. And those who wanted to purify the Anglican Church were called Puritans, right? And so those Puritans that we're familiar with and are most famous because of the persecution that was taking place in England against them, a lot of times looking for religious liberties, they had to leave England in order to find them, be able to practice their brand of Christianity the way that they wanted to. But there was another group that was similar to those Puritans They said, you know what, it don't matter what we do, we're never going to purify the church inside the church. We're never going to make it what it needs to be. The only way to become what we need to be is to separate totally from the Anglican Church. We're going to have to just come out and start our own. You know, we're going to have to come out from among them and demonstrate to them what Christianity is supposed to be. And so these separatists are those that rebelled against, if you will, the Church of England. Now, our pilgrims that came to the Plymouth plantation, the Plymouth colony in 1620 in what is now Massachusetts, they are English separatists. They said, we'll go to the New World, and in that New World we will create a city that's set on a hill where even those that we'll create at the first society of true Christianity, where our Anglican brothers and sisters can see what we want and become that. So understand what we mean by Anglican separatism first and foremost. I talked about how that many times, because of the persecution that was being launched against both the Puritans and the separatists, that because of that persecution, many times they were forced to leave England. And we know that from American history, first and foremost. But certainly the New World is not the only place that they went to. In 1606 or thereabouts, John Smith, S-M-Y-T-H, John Smith broke his ties to the Church of England and began meeting with about 60 or 70 separatists. And because of the persecution that was being launched against them, they relocated from out of England into Amsterdam. And so they went to the Netherlands, and there they were baptized as believers in 1609. So again, coming back to this idea of rebaptism, of believers' baptism, and Smith wrote a tract spelling out that infants should not be baptized, and that anti-Christians, upon conversion, those who weren't already Christians by tradition, by the way, that they should be baptized upon conversion in order to be admitted into the true church. A scriptural church, he said, should consist only of regenerate believers who have been baptized on a personal confession of faith. Now, along with Smith was a layman by the name of Thomas Helwys, H-E-L-W-Y-S. And just a couple of years afterwards, when the persecution began to subside in England, Helwys led the group back into England in 1611. And the Helwys group and the congregations that came up, that sprang up as around them, they became known as General Baptists. And in 1638,
Could you spell out
General Baptist,
the name?
Helwys,
Yeah.
H-E-L-W-Y-S. And I may not even be pronouncing that correctly, but that's how it's spelled. In 1638, Calvinist John Spilsbury, and we talked about Calvinism in the first session last week, he argued that baptism by immersion was the true form. Now again, we stop to ask, how had baptism been practiced up until the 17th century? Pretty much by pouring water over the convert or sprinkling the water over the child. And so John Spilsbury began to argue that true baptism was baptism by immersion, and the Calvinist Baptists that grew out of that tradition became known as particular Baptists, or sometimes they're called Reformed Baptists.
Like Spilsbury, like Pillsbury.
With an S, yeah. Let me give you some key Baptist doctrine and practice. These are These are some of the things that will help to identify what it means to be a Baptist. All right? First of all, Baptists typically emphasize believers' baptism. And again, this is a profession of faith. That somebody is they're being baptized upon a confession that I have put trust in Christ and Christ's redemptive work at Calvary. They're making a profession upon that faith. They've been baptized in the same manner that John baptized Jesus, being identified there with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And immersion is typically the key form. Believers' baptism. Most baptism is by immersion upon profession of faith, and almost always in the Trinitarian formula, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So believers' baptism is important. A second doctrinal thought that's important is the idea of soul competency, or sometimes called soul liberty. This is the idea that each person is responsible for his own spiritual life. Now again, I'm putting everything in contrast to Catholic thought. Catholic thought says you can't get saved without the church. That the church is important, that confession to a priest and that following the ordinances of the church, that being a part of the church, the one true Catholic Church, is necessary for salvation. Baptist thought says that each individual is responsible for his own spiritual life. So that I don't go to heaven someday because my parents brought me to the church when I was an infant and had me baptized and I became a Christian. Baptist thought says, no, you are responsible, not what your parents did for you and not what the church does for you. You are personally accountable to God for your own soul. So it's the idea of soul competency or soul liberty. A third idea is that of universal priesthood. Sometimes it's called the priesthood of all believers. And I know that phrase, priesthood of all believers, may mean different things to different people. But in Baptist thought, the idea is that, just simply put, that all Christians have access to God on their own. That Christ alone is my mediator. That Christ alone is my intercessor. That Christ alone is my high priest. And I have access to God the Father through Jesus, His Son. And I have that access on my own. Right? Here's a fourth thing. Baptists typically teach that there are two ordinances of the church. How many sacraments are there in the Roman Catholic Church? 7. All right? And Baptists typically teach that there are two ordinances. One of those is baptism. And we talked about believers' baptism and what we mean by that. And the other ordinance is the Lord's Supper. And sometimes, in some Baptist circles, the Lord's Supper also includes with it foot washing. And some would say, well, that sounds like 3, but most Baptists would lump them together. And so you've got two ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper. Now I use the word ordinances because in Baptist thought, again, the Catholic Church uses the word sacrament. And the idea is that these things are necessary, that partaking in the Eucharist, eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ are necessary. They're salvific in their effect, that they're necessary in order to be saved. And the Baptist Church teaches they're not sacraments, they're ordinances. That Christ commanded these things, and so that's why we do them. Sacraments having the power to effect salvation, ordinances, this is what Christ commanded, and so this is what we do. Two ordinances of the church. Also, in Baptist thought, is the idea of two offices of the church. I'm afraid I've lost my mouse. Maybe it's coming back. Two offices of the church. And the two offices, if you tell me what they are. No, the two offices, or officers.
Elder.
That's one big
In
issue.
the deacon and the pastor. Typically, the Baptist church recognizes those two offices of the church, the pastor and the deacon. Now, of course, in the, you know, and we're comparing everything to the Anglican church or comparing everything to the Roman Catholic church. The idea is there are deacons, servants in the church. There are also priests, and then there are also bishops, and so that there's a hierarchy. Baptist church teaches two offices in the church, that of the pastor and the deacon. And they might use the term elder. Typically, the term elder or in this tradition, bishop or pastor are almost used interchangeably. That those titles typically mean the same thing, or that they fulfill the same function. So pastor and deacon. I don't even know what number we're on, but the next one is autonomy of the local church. And if you don't hear anything else that's said during the entire course, hear this, right? The stress in the Baptist thought is the autonomy of the local church, that each local body is congregationally governed. Each local church is responsible for itself. It is separate. It functions together separate. And it has all ecclesiastical authority within that body. So that no matter how it might make decisions and whether it's the lay people and the whole church votes, or whether it's the deacons that are given some authority, or the pastor that's given, that all authority in the local church is in the local church. That each separate congregation is autonomous, is separate. And so, again, in contrast to the Anglican church that they separated from, or Roman Catholics or Greek Orthodox, where there's a hierarchical structure, where there is a pope, and there may be 5 patriarchs, that are recognized as equal, but Rome's a little more equal, or Rome's the first, or whatever. And each of those is divided into sees, and there's a particular metropolitans, diocese. That each local church is part of a bigger diocese, that's part of a bigger region, or what have you, a bigger bishopric, to where that there are levels of authority that go all the way up to the archbishop, or all the way up to the pope, or whichever persuasion. In the Baptist church, there is nobody that is synonymous with the pope. If you ask somebody who is the most powerful, who's got the most authority, which Baptist has the most authority in the Baptist church? Well, that's going to vary. Then you might talk about Billy Graham, having a wide circle of influence, but that's not the same thing as by any means, that in each local church, whoever's got the most authority is either the pastor or the deacon, or whoever the local church boss is, but it's in that church. And so understand that mindset of Baptist doctrine and practice. And then the last thing that I want to point out is that Baptists have always been champions of the idea of separation of church and state. When Thomas Jefferson wrote his famous Wall of Separation letter that gets quoted over and over and over again, right? And sometimes people think that it's in the First Amendment, but it's not. It's in the letter. Who was Jefferson writing the letter to? Baptists. It's a letter to the Danbury Baptist Convention. And basically, he's preaching to the choir, telling them what they wanted to hear. The idea is Baptists resent both the intrusion and interference of the government, of the state, in their local level. And because Baptists have never been the state religion, they've never been the state religion, they resented having to pay taxes to pay for Anglican priesthood, or Anglican clergy members, or Anglican buildings, and what have you. And again, that is, it's tied connected with that idea of the autonomous congregation, we ought to be able to put our monies into our church. And so these are some key Baptist doctrine and practice. I want to go into this next section. I want to talk about this next section, talk about Baptist organization. We're going to look at some, being able to group together individual congregations in a way so that when we talk, here's the thing that's so important to understand. When I say Baptist, immediately something comes to your mind. You know a Baptist, right? Or you know a Baptist church, or what? And sometimes whatever your relationship with Ben, or whatever you know about that person, sometimes we can paint Baptists with a pretty broad brush. And so, well, they must be like, because that's the way Baptists are. Well, the truth of the matter is, to say that's how Baptists are is kind of a misnomer, because there's so many different kinds of Baptists that it's impossible to lump them all together nicely. And so that's why we're going to talk about why it's so helpful to look at groups. But before we do, a joke. A man was about to commit suicide by jumping off of a bridge when another came upon him. He said, "Stop, don't do it." Man said, "But I have nothing to live for." He said, "Well, maybe I can help. Are you religious?" "Yes, I am." "Well, me too." "Are you Jewish, Christian, or Muslim?" "I'm a Christian." "Me too." "Are you Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant?" "Protestant." "Me too." "Are you Calvinist or Arminian?" "I'm Calvinist." "Me too." "Are you liberal or conservative?" "Conservative." "Me too." "Are you evangelical or fundamental?" And he said, "I'm evangelical." "Me too." "Are you charismatic, reformed, or Baptist?" "I'm Baptist." "Me too." "Are you General Baptist, Northern Baptist, or Conference Baptist?" "I'm Conference Baptist." "Me too." "Are you Conference Baptist of the 1932 Conference or Conference Baptist of the 1946 Conference?" "Conference Baptist of the 1932 Conference." 1932? "Well, then die, you infidel heretic scum." And he pushed him off the bridge. And so even when you try to lump together Baptists together, the truth of the matter is there's so many things that separate, so many things that divide, sometimes in doctrine, sometimes in practice, sometimes in geography and in history. But we're going to try to group some Baptists together, look at some Baptist groups. And first of all, we're going to start with particular Baptists. I mentioned this phrase just a moment ago. And just let me say, so many Baptists, or so many issues, have helped separate Baptists into seemingly infinite number of groups. There are issues of Calvinism versus Arminianism, issues of eschatology, issues of the doctrine of separation from the world, and whether you should associate with those that are of the world, issues of even speaking in tongues and the operation of other charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit in the modern church, how the Bible should be interpreted, the extent to which mission boards should be used to support missionaries have historically divided Baptists, the extent to which non-members may participate in the Lord's Supper services, which translation of Scripture to use, dispensationalism versus covenant theology, the role of women in marriage, the ordination of women as deacons or as pastors, attitudes to and involvement in the ecumenical movement. So many things that separate Baptists. But let's try to keep it simple. In England, you had particular Baptists that we talked about just that I mentioned just a few moments ago. These are Calvinists in their theology, and for a refresher course, basically what we're saying is the particular Baptists believe in a limited atonement. That Christ didn't die for everybody, He only died for the elect. That the blood of Christ was shed for many, not for all, for many. And so they believed in a limited atonement, and only the elect were going to be saved. We talked last week about irresistible grace and some of the other things. And so those that identified with Calvinism became particular Baptists, and those that identified with Arminianism, that is free will, that whosoever will, and unlimited atonement, that Christ died for everybody, became General Baptist. So in England, they're in two major groups of Baptists, particular Baptists and General Baptists. Now, in America, where we want to focus our attention on, because we're going to get more specific, and get to our own roots. In America, regular Baptists tended to be moderately Calvinistic. Yeah, and there are varying degrees of Calvinism, whether or not you accept all 5 points or some of the points. But moderately Calvinistic, they tend to be closed communion. That is, that communion is only available to those that we know are redeemed. Those who are a part of the church. The visible church that we can actually see, and we have evidence that they are Christians. They are members of this congregation. They tend to be closed communion, and they tended to observe foot washing. And then there's separate Baptists. And separate Baptists are free will, are many. Separate Baptists tended to embrace the Great Awakening and the enthusiasm, the revivalism that followed it. They were called separate because in the churches where the Great Awakening was embraced, and in the churches where the Great Awakening was rejected, that the conflict that existed there divided congregations a lot of times between old lights and new lights. Now, if you take an American history class, these are going to be familiar terms with you because in colonial America, in colonial American religion, these are terms that constantly get thrown out there. The idea is old lights tend to be those that turned down or pulled themselves away from, decried the enthusiasm of revivals, that they tended to not be evangelical, whereas the new lights tended to be those who embraced revivalism and everything that came with it, and that typically became evangelicals. And so you've got these two groups, regular Baptists and separate Baptists, and they were separate in that they separated themselves from the old light churches that decried the revivalism. Somewhere around 1800, some of these groups of regular Baptists and separate Baptists united together in Kentucky and Virginia and North and South Carolina in particular, and created United Baptist churches. Time doesn't allow me to talk about Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists and the differences there. Of course, this is a Civil War issue where the tendency was that Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists split over the issue of slavery and the place of, and ultimately the place of the freed slave within the church, split over that issue. Now the Northern Baptists tend to be more liberal politically and theologically. Southern Baptists, there are not many more groups, there are not many more conservative groups than Southern Baptists in our country today. But the United Baptists came about, and that's what we want to focus on. Let me talk about Baptist structure just a little bit. And just again, I want to stress again, autonomy in the local church. Each local church is congregationally governed. Usually, deacons take care of most of the business of the church. And the church congregation might vote on issues that are of greater importance. But generally speaking, the government of the local church was seated in those deacons, the deacon board, to take care of the church. Now, while each church was independent in its own, churches might participate in an association and a group of churches in a particular region that that get together for cooperation and fellowship. So in a Baptist association typically would be any number of churches within a particular region. You might ask about the Baptist associations in your region to get a feel for what's available there. But basically the idea is you need churches with which to fellowship. You need churches that when you're in revival that you can call on. They're part of the association. The association has a particular doctrine or a particular set of practices that they observe. They're similar in their worship styles. And so you've got preachers that you can call upon, not only to preach, but also when it comes time to ordain, ministers or deacons within your own church. A lot of times you call on the association to come together and help to conduct that ordination service. If you've only got one minister in your church, it's kind of hard for that one guy to lay hands on somebody and separate them and ordain them a deacon all by himself. So typically you call the churches within the association to come together. They may work together on particular projects, maybe a joint mission project. They work together to have seminars or workshops, leadership meetings, strategize about how to conduct Sunday schools or other works that may be of a collective effort. Baptist associations, for example, right now might be working together, independent local churches working together within the association to help with things like hurricane relief, disaster relief in your area. They may work together in the association to start colleges. They may work together to start ministries that are outside of the local church. Sometimes there are hospitals that are Baptist hospitals. Well, there are very few churches, independent, local, autonomous congregations that have the financial resources to launch their own hospital. And so they do this collectively, sometimes through associations. So those associations tend to be smaller within a geographical bounds where it's easy to fellowship with each other, to get together for participation. And then each of those associations may belong to a larger national association, an associational membership in a national convention, the Southern Baptist Convention or the Northern Baptist Convention, for example. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest today. The Northern Baptist, by the way, now called the American Baptist Convention. So this is just again a glimpse of Baptist structure. Now, let's get specific. And let us talk about the South Union Association of United Baptists. We talked a little bit about the United Baptists and the history of where they came from. Now we're going to talk about one association in particular, the South Union Association of United Baptists. And it is important because this is the group that most of the early members of the Church of God in the Mountain Assembly had been affiliated with. These are the kinds of churches that they had been participating in, had been members of when holiness came to their region. So let's talk first of all about the history of the association. The South Union Association was constituted at Clear Fork Meeting House in what is now Whitley County, Kentucky, in September 1815. I don't think there was a Whitley County in 1815, right?
Not to my knowledge.
So I think at the time it was Knox County. But Clear Fork Meeting House, in September 1815, by delegates from the Cumberland River Church, which is now First Baptist Church in Barberville, and the churches that were part of the association in 1815, they were typically and principally located in what is now Knox County. And some of the churches were new churches. They were fairly new churches. Others of those churches were arms of stronger churches. Like for example, First Baptist in Barberville is a big church. It was a big church 200 years ago, and it planted churches in these smaller communities. And so some of these smaller churches, again, Baptist churches are autonomous, independently, congregationally governed churches. Some of these small, when they started a church in those areas to reach those communities, again, we're talking about 100 years before the automobile. Travel wasn't. So nowadays, nowadays people can leave Trosper or Artemis or whatever and drive into Barberville, and you can do that without any problem. Nowadays, people could leave Goldbug or Mountain Ash or Saxton or wherever and drive into Williamsburg or drive up to Corbin. But 200 years ago, you didn't have that kind of luxury, and so it's so important to get churches into so many areas. That you could, but some of these churches were new churches, others had been around for some time. Some of them came out of Stockton's Valley Association. All that is known about that early history is its organization day. There are no records before 1830. But in 1830, the South Union Association had 18 churches with 489 members. And the churches had a tendency to be anti-missionary or indifferent on the issue altogether. And we talked about the issue. I didn't mention missionary Baptist churches that came about as the idea is: should we take care of ourselves, or should we reach out beyond our own? And what is the purpose of mission boards, and whether or not churches should use them? Some of these things that help divide churches. But the South Union Association early on tended to be anti-missionary. The complete records of the association are available from 1864 to the present. And on your jump drive, there are some of the pages that predate 1900. All of the minutes that exist before 1900 are handwritten minutes in a great big thick ledger book. And they're available at their office, at the mission office building for the South Union Mountain Zion Association. And so you can see some of the pages. I copied some of the pages that were relevant, and so that you can see them. But from 1864 to the present, the oldest churches in the association are Jellicoe Creek, Red Bird, Wolf Creek, and Patterson Creek. Some of those names will sound familiar before we're done.
You said Jellicoe Creek, Red Bird, Wolf Creek, and what?
Patterson Creek. You know where that's at too, Gary?
Patterson Creek, I'm not familiar with, but Red Bird, yes. Jellicoe Creek, yes. And Wolf Creek, yes.
Patterson Creek's over in that vicinity also. Here's another, just typifying the association's history. South Union Association has prided itself on being a mother of associations. These dates don't matter, but in 1831, the Laurel River Association of Baptist Churches was formed with 5 churches from the South Union Association. In 1843, North Concord Association was formed by churches that were dismissed by letter from South Union Association. By 1870, it had reduced, but then it had grown again to where there were 26 churches, and it divided its territory. And those that were west of the line became the West Union Association. Those that were east of the line, stayed with the South Union Association. Now, the line was the mouth of Jellicoe Creek on the Cumberland River, running south with Jellicoe Mountain down into Elk Valley, into Tennessee. And so the West Union Baptist Association typically today has churches in what is now McCreary County, Kentucky, and Scott County, Tennessee, while the South Union kept the churches that were in what is now Whitley County, Kentucky, and Campbell County, Tennessee. And again, these things have been important. The Mount Zion Association was founded in 1885 when the New Zion Church left to join other churches and help form it. East Union Association in 1891 with 7 churches from the South Union Association. 1906, Elk Fork Association established itself with churches from out of the association. In 1997, the old Mount Zion Association that had come out in 1906, or I'm sorry, in 1891, the Mount Zion Association came back and joined again and unified with the South Union Association, and now it is the South Union Mount Zion Association of Baptist churches, it's actually the South Union Mount Zion Baptist Association. And in 2015, they celebrated 200 years of membership with 50 churches. I went to their associational meeting, the 202nd association meeting a couple weeks ago. They're just outside of Williamsburg, and just to see what they had going on, just to be part of that. And so the association, like I said, with 50 churches going strong, and again, most of those are within that within that same geographical region: Whitley County, McCurry County, Campbell County, Scott County, and maybe a few on the outskirts. Let me throw just a few things from their history that are going to be at least relevant in our discussion. In 1891, the association asked its churches to restrict the number of messengers that they sent to the associational meeting, the assembly, if you will. They were asked to restrict the number of delegates that they sent to one delegate for every 25 members. Before that, there was no restriction, and so you might have a church that had 25 people, but they sent 20 of them to the association meeting to vote and participate. Another church may have had 150 members. They only had 3 that could go. And so when you see the list of the numbers of messengers, there's no restriction, and you can't even say, well, that church only had 3 delegates, or that they only had 1. That must not have been a very big church. There was no, and sometimes geography played a part. For example, the host church. They might have 25 delegates just because it was easier for people to get there.
What year was that?
That was in 1891.
When they set the restriction.
When they asked the churches, they asked the churches to do it voluntarily. But I mention it because I want you to see how that's going to affect ourselves later on down the road, right? That the idea of limiting the number of delegates to each church to 2 delegates, at least it has its roots in our Baptist heritage. In 1895, it was ordered that each church submit a list of ordained ministers in order to be printed in the minute book. So the idea is, let's list all of the preachers by name, those who have credentials, those who are in good standing, so that we know in our association, if we need somebody to call upon, for example, to be a pastor, call upon to be, so that their names and their addresses were listed in the minute book. The first ministers list was added to their minutes. In 1898, they dropped the word delegate and started using the word messenger. Now they're going to change that later on. They're going to go back to the word delegate. But I mentioned that because 9 years later, at the first assembly, the Church of God Mountain Assembly, we don't have any delegates, we have messengers. And so, you see again, they took the terminology of the structure that they were familiar with, and they brought it with them. In 1901, there was a poll of the churches, said later, asked the church to give your opinion on the subject, to determine whether they wanted a meeting, the associational meeting, restricted to ministers only, or whether they wanted to open it up and leave it open as it had been for the ministers and the delegates, the lay members from the local church. And so they were already beginning to think about whether or not to restrict the meeting to only the ministers. And this is going to be important again in a couple weeks when we get to the 1940s. because Church of God Mountain Assembly is going to have that same conversation, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But just to familiarize yourself with some of the historical ideas that were involved. Let me talk about how these association meetings, just some of the features of them, and the first thing I want to mention, and this is not an order of business, it's just sharing some things that typically happen in the associational meeting. First of all, there would be a reading of the church letters. Each church would send a letter to the association listing the names of its messengers. These are our delegates. Of course, they would be asked to list who the pastor is, who the clerk is. Typically, they would want to know on what day they had their meeting, and other information. These letters were read. They were read publicly in the association meeting until 1970. They continued to read them until 1970. And so they listed the names of any number of delegates from the churches, along with the church moderator or pastor, the clerk, and it was by lettering in that the church was joining the association for another year. We're going to participate. We're going to be a part of the association, and so the letter was an important part of belonging to the association. There's almost always some note on hospitality, so that some resolution that was passed that was thanking the members of the community and the church for their hospitality. I'll ask Brother Gary because he's familiar with the area. Brother Gary, how many motels are there in Saxton?
In Saxton?
Yeah.
Down around Saxton, none. But up in Williamsburg itself,
Right.
easily 3 or 4.
Ryan's Creek motels?
Not around Ryan's Creek that I know.
Not within, again, you're Williamsburg or Whitley City to get to a motel. The idea is 100 years ago when people came in to stay for a few days in a particular community, there were no motels, there were no restaurants. If you had people that were coming to stay for a few days meeting and attend church services, typically the host church, the pastor would get up and say to his congregation, we've got a family of 5 here that needs a place to stay. Here's another family of 3 and basically the people in the community would take them home and would keep them in their homes for 2 or 3 days, feeding them, giving them a place to stay, and so that they could participate in the association meeting. That practice continued in the Church of God Mountain Assembly, in some cases right up into the 50s, where the pastor and the pastor's wife would do everything they could to accommodate the travelers that would come in to make sure that they got them places to stay. So they would always extend thanks to the community, to the church, for its hospitality. There would be an election of officers. These typically included a moderator. The moderator would conduct the business session for that meeting. It was not a position where he held it for a year or this and that, but basically he was elected at the beginning of the association meeting. The association meeting would typically be called to order by whoever had been the moderator the previous year, and they would conduct an election by ballot, and they would elect a moderator and an assistant moderator in case the meeting got long and somebody else needed to fill the chair, you want to sit down or whatever. They'd have a moderator, an assistant moderator, and a clerk, and sometimes an assistant clerk. And sometimes they would appoint people different. Sometimes the clerk would be responsible for reading the letters along with maybe somebody else. Can you imagine trying to read 25 letters? By the time you got done, your throat would be dry. And so they would elect officers. They would always appoint a committee on divine services. Anybody know what the Committee on Divine Services did? The Divine Services Committee, what?
Sounds like home missions.
No. The Divine Services Committee was what we call today a program committee. The only difference was the Divine Services Committee would choose preachers for that convention that was taking place that week. And so you would have during the business session, for example, that morning you might say the Divine Services Committee reports that tonight such and such will be preaching. Now, in these churches, sometimes, this was a big thing. The association meeting was a big thing. And sometimes the church wasn't big enough to hold everybody, so they might have preaching in different places. So the Divine Services Committee would say, tonight at the church house, Reverend Silcox is going to be preaching, and then over at, at some, maybe at an outdoors place, or maybe at a, or at a community building, or in somebody's home. They might have 3 or 4 different services that would go on, but the Divine Services Committee would announce, these are who is preaching tonight, and this is who's going to be preaching in the morning.
You're in minutes almost.
It stopped.
It says 0 minutes, so I said.
Okay. Okay. We'll figure out what to do next. Let me say another thing. These were the other services that would take place. Typically, there would be an introductory sermon that was preached that preceded the business. And the introductory sermon, the one that preached it, the keynote speaker, if you will, he was chosen the previous year. They would have a vote at the end of the business session where they would vote on who's going to preach the introductory sermon. Eventually, the South Union Association adopted a second annual sermon where the introductory sermon was preached prior to business, and then they would have a doctrinal sermon that was delivered the second day. Sometimes there would be corresponding letters that would be read. The associations would have their meeting, and I mentioned all the associations that came out of the South Union Baptist Association, these other groups. Sometimes the other associations would formally send representatives from the West Union. We're here from the West Union Baptist Association. They would bring a letter from their association, maybe giving a report on the welfare of their organization and pledging their support and continued friendship and brotherhood to the South Union Association. And so these letters would be read, and then oftentimes there would be a response that would be sent. We'll send a letter of greetings, and they'll pick some people from our association to go to their association when it meets, in next month or whenever. And so there would be correspondence between the 2 associations. And in the next hour, we'll talk about why that's important. Another thing that typically took place was circular letters. These were often written to send to the churches. Somebody would write basically what they were doing was they were writing a sermon or writing a doctrinal letter. The Bible was the only doctrine. But their articles of faith were printed annually in the minutes, and they were a guideline. And so sometimes they would send a representative to the churches to help to help solve some of those problems that they might have, or to address a particular doctrinal stance, and send those letters to be read. Just like in the New Testament days, when you finish reading this letter, send it to Hierapolis and read the letter that I sent to them also. The first Sabbath schools were established in the 1870s, and the local churches eagerly anticipated reporting on the progress of those schools at the associational meeting. And then the association would always draft resolutions. They'd have some sort of committee, a resolution committee that would draft resolutions on and show their opinion on almost every imaginable subject. Subjects like liquor, excluded ministers, advice to ministers, every possible subject. One of the recent letters from about 25 years or so ago was about lottery tickets and their advice to convenience stores to open up a second line so that people who are buying lottery tickets wouldn't, cause you to take so much time. They weren't condemning selling the lottery tickets altogether, but just have a separate line so as folks who don't buy them. Well, that's good advice, but that was the kind of thing that they sent. Let's talk about the holiness controversy, and in the next 9.5 minutes, let's talk about this break. We talked about the holiness movement, so now we're bringing the Reformation and holiness together. in one. I'm going to talk about two individuals in particular, Elders John Parks and Andrew Silcox. Two men, they're called elders in the minutes of the South Union Association. And don't confuse that again. You know, the word elder and something pastor is sometimes used simultaneously. You probably would never call a 20-year-old an elder. You know, unless you're a Mormon, you'd never, refer to somebody like. But so usually there was some experience that was behind it too before you typically call someone an elder. But both John Parks and Andrew Silcox were elders in the sense that it was used in the South Union Association. John Hansford Parks was born July 5th, 1861. He married Rachel Thomas July 16th, 1880. Andrew J. Silcox was born November the 5th, 1863, just a couple of years younger. He married Jane Albus Thomas June the 3rd, 1883, just a few years later. Rachel and Jane were two of the daughters of Daniel Thomas and Nancy Broyles Thomas. Now, two sisters married John Parks and Andrew Silcox. Another sister, another brother, Daniel Jr., was married to John Parks' half-sister, Emma. You say, well, that sounds like a close-knit family. If that wasn't close enough, Daniel Thomas, that I mentioned just a moment ago, is the brother of Helen Thomas Parks, who is John's mother. Yes, John Parks married his first cousin. It was not illegal in the state of Kentucky at that time. It is now, but it was not at that time, nor was it uncommon to marry your first cousin. John Parks had been orphaned at a young age. His dad had died when he was very young, and so it seemed natural. Marry your uncle's daughter. You think the Thomas family is large? This Daniel Thomas, that was their father, that was Rachel and Jane's father. Daniel's father, Robert Thomas, is the grandfather of 5 delegates at the First Assembly, not counting these 2 granddaughters who married Parks and Silcox, 2 of the founding fathers. So there's 7 individuals who are grandchildren of Robert Thomas by blood or by marriage. So when somebody asks you who the founder of the Church of God Mountain Assembly is, Robert Thomas might be a good guess. Both Parks and Silcox began preaching in about 1888. Silcox preached his first sermon January 23rd in 1889. So Parks just a little before Silcox, both of them preaching at the United Baptist Church at Wolf Creek. Let's talk about John Parks just a moment. Parks was a delegate at the South Union Association since 1889. So it's about the time he started preaching. He started attending the annual association meeting. He was just popular enough that he preached the introductory sermon. We talk about this as the keynote message that's voted on a year ahead of time. He preached the introductory sermon in 1891 from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. He preached the introductory sermon again in 1897 from 2 Corinthians 11:14. He preached in 1901 from 1 Timothy 3:16. So 3 times within 12 years of starting preaching, he was popular enough, chosen to be the preacher of the introductory sermon. He served as moderator of the South Union Association in 1897, again in 1898, in 1901, and in 1902. And so you can see there are 2 different years during this period of time, 2 different years where Parks not only preached the introductory sermon, but also was chosen as moderator. Important guy, right? Let's talk about Andrew Silcox. Silcox was a delegate at the South Union Association since 1890. So again, year after he started preaching, he began to be involved with the association meetings. He preached the introductory sermon 4 times during the period of time we're looking at. He actually preached it again another time later on. But in 1892, 1896, 1900, and 1902, he preached the introductory sermon. This is, during this span of time we're looking at, 8 times, someone who became a part of the Church of God Mountain Assembly in the first decade of the 20th century was preaching the keynote message at the South Union Baptist Association. Silcox also was elected moderator in 1899 and 1900. There was a span of 6 years in a row where somebody from what became the Church of God Mountain Assembly served as moderator of the association, or 5 times in 6 years.
Moderator, you mean what? Conducting the-
He conducted the business meeting. I want to talk about the origins of holiness. How did holiness come into? At the end of Luther Gibson's history book, he tells and began preaching Wesleyan holiness, that a man could be empowered by Christ and by the Holy Ghost to live without sin. Bryant says that among the first 2 to receive the blessing of sanctification, the first 2 to embrace it, were John Thomas, who's a cousin of those other Thomases that we just talked about, and Anderson Alder, 2 men that he said were among the first to get to become sanctified. At some point, that doctrine was embraced by John Parks and Andrew Silcox and others. My estimate is that somewhere, we don't have exact records, we have personal testimonies of different people that testified about getting sanctified at certain times. There is no reference to sanctification or modern apostasy or dangerous doctrine or anything like that. There's no reference to that in the South Union Association minutes prior to 1902. No reference at all. 1903, they start to take that tells me the fact that Parks and Silcox were still preaching introductory sermons and they were still being elected moderator. They're still in good standing with the association, so they're certainly not preaching heresy at this point in time. But somewhere about 1902 or 1903, they began to embrace this doctrine. And in 1902, the South Union Association advised churches to exclude and call in the credentials of any minister or member who teaches doctrines contrary to the Articles of Faith of United Baptist Churches. In 1903, they said, beware of men who are members of Baptist churches who are advancing a doctrine contrary to the Articles of Faith of the United Baptist Church, and not to invite such a one to preach. They appointed a committee of 8 to investigate churches where this is reported. Okay? And somewhere about 1904, the disputed doctrine came to the attention of the association, and in particular in the local church in Wolf Creek. At the end of the 1903 assembly, John Parks had been selected to preach the introductory sermon in 1904. They show up in 1904, and before he can preach the sermon, somebody makes a motion. Let's table the sermon until we hear the report of the Committee on Disputed Doctrine. They heard the report, and when they were finished, they ended up saying, well, we'll have the sermon tomorrow. And they appointed a committee of 9 to meet with John Parks and A.J. Silcox and others in regard to disputed doctrine. And then later that year, they passed a motion to withdraw fellowship from Little Wolf Creek and Zion Hill Church. Sometime around this same time at Wolf Creek, John Parks was pastoring the church at Wolf Creek, not to be confused with Little Wolf Creek, 2 different churches, just a few miles apart, but they're 2 different churches. At Wolf Creek, they were having a meeting. James Bryant tells the story. Mom and Dad were members of the church at Wolf Creek. They had a meeting to discuss the change. John Parks got up and he said, they claim we're preaching heresies, a doctrine contrary to the articles of faith and rules of decorum of the Baptist Church. Now we're going to ask the church to vote on what you're going to do. Take your articles of faith and rules of decorum, the ones laid down by man, or are you going to take the Bible? All that vote for the Bible instead of man's work are voting for us to remain as your pastors. And all that vote against the Bible are voting us out as pastors, because we're going to stay with the Bible. And Bryant says they voted the Bible out by a large majority. When that happened, Alex Dickerson rose up and asked for his letter. Give him up, we'll take our name off the books. His wife wanted her moved, and then there were others, many others, that asked for their letter. And so this group of people that left Wolf Creek, they formed a church that they named the Holiness Baptist Church. One night at Patterson Creek, I mentioned Anderson Alder was one of the first to get sanctified. One night at Patterson Creek, Stephen Bryant was pastoring, and he was up preaching. While he was preaching, Brother Alder would shout out, "Glory, hallelujah," during the meeting that night. And he would do that periodically, and it interrupted Brother Bryant, who was trying to preach. And so he called him down. He told him to hold his peace until after he finished his sermon. And so, of course, he felt real good about the way he treated him. Told him what. And so after the service was over, Brother Alder came to him and just hugged him by the neck and told him, "God bless you, Brother Brian, I love you." And went on his way home, and on his way home said, "Glory, hallelujah." And so this bothered Stephen Bryant about the way that he had acted and the way he had treated him, and then for him to turn around and love him anyway. After I embarrassed this man, he should have had a different attitude. And so it weighed heavy on his heart all night long, and couldn't sleep at night. And so he spent the night in prayer. Sometime in the middle of the night, Brother Bryant screamed out, "Glory, hallelujah!" Something like lightning had struck through his heart. And he said, "This guy's got something that you don't have," or he couldn't have acted that way. And so in the middle of the night, he cries out this, "Glory, hallelujah!" And his wife said, Sister Mary said, "Stephen, hush! Everybody in the neighborhood's going to think you're sanctified." And he said, "Thank God. That is what has happened." He said, "Right now I wish the whole world knew it." And so in 1905, 2 letters were received at the South Union Baptist Association from the church at Maple Creek. One church pastored by John Parks, the other church pastored by someone else, and the letter by Parks was rejected. He's not a part of us. And so that year, 1905, a resolution was adopted, and it said this specifically. It said, "Be it resolved that we advise all our churches to beware of all men who preach doctrine contrary to the Word of God, such doctrine as modern sanctification and apostasy. Be it further resolved that we advise them not to allow them to be pastors of the churches or preach in their church houses, and advise all of our churches in our bounds not to call John Parks, A.J. Silcox, Alan Moses, T.D. Moses, Stephen Bryant, N.K. Parks, A. Thomas, or anyone else guilty of heresy as pastor or to preach in our churches. Any church holding one of the above brethren as pastor is advised to remove them at once. Any church not obeying this advice will be considered out of harmony with this assembly." And so by 1905, the ties between these men who had been Baptist in their doctrine, Baptist in their practice, who had embraced Wesleyan holiness and experienced sanctification for themselves, these men were formally disfellowshipped and told, if the churches were told, if you keep them as pastor, you're no longer part of the association, and churches were advised to not call upon them as pastor. And so the relationship between our founding fathers and the Baptist Church came to a conclusion then in 1905 at that association meeting. Now, I've went about 5 minutes longer than I should have, but I'm going to stop just a second and ask, anybody have any questions before we take a short break and then come back to the second session?
Are we going to get into 1906 here next, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question will probably be answered then.
Okay. Well, let's take a break then. What time is it?
25.
25. Let's take.
Bad.
Gary, do you want to ask your question now?
Basically,
identity. And we'll talk about the early days of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and just talk about who we are and how we developed our own identity. And we'll look at several different factors that I feel like contributed to developing an identity. Somebody says, well, who are you? Well, your name is one thing, but there's more than just that identifies who you are. So I want to talk about some of those things. I want to start with first of all, talking about the founding fathers, and just talk about the role of people in developing an identity. Who we are is about people. The church, it's not an institution. The church is people. And so, so if you're going to talk about who the Church of God Mountain Assembly is, and let's just say this. The greatest asset that the Church of God Mountain Assembly has is its people. It's the greatest thing we have to offer is family. It's not our great mission program that you get involved in. It's not our great youth campgrounds of it. The fellowship, the family, the camaraderie. That is the thing that cannot be matched anywhere else in any other organization. Hands down, everybody that leaves our organization, they always say the same thing. What I miss is the fellowship. We don't have the Bible college that some folks have, but what we do have is a fellowship. And so people is our greatest asset. That's where I want to start with. Look at the founding father and talk about the role of people in developing an identity. And just looking at the first assemblies, and I want to just talk about the first few assemblies, just throw out some dates, and we'll talk about some of the things that happened at those assemblies. Now, J.H. Bryant testified that after the Wolf Creek Church split, the remnant of that church formed the Holiness Baptist Church. Now, apparently, I think, and I don't know, but I think that became Sheep Creek. What's mentioned in the First Minute book as Sheep Creek, I think that's probably that congregation. And that church, and that in other churches, there were entire congregations. We know Little Wolf Creek and Zion Hill and Hayes Creek, they were all Zion Hill and Wolf Creek were excluded from the South Union Baptist Association. I'm pretty sure that Hayes Creek was excluded from the West Union Baptist Association. These entire churches came out. In some occasions, local congregations were split, and a holiness group formed alongside of them. I know that the church at Ryan's Creek was a split off from what the Ryan's Creek Baptist Church. Ryan's Creek Church, when it first started, there was an old log house that they tore out the partitions, and that's where they met until they could build what is now the Jellicoe Creek Church, just a few miles up the road. And it's the oldest church building in the Church of God Mountain Assembly, still standing. So these congregations were already forming. By as early as 1904, there were Holiness Baptist churches. Now, again, some of these churches, John Parks tried to let her in 1905. He was a Puritan in the sense that I'm going to stay in this organization. I'm going to purify it. I'm going to bring holiness to this Baptist association. I want the whole association to be Baptist. So in their mind, there was no separating they were embracing the Bible. They weren't creating a new denomination. They were just accepting the Bible and what God had in store for them. So I want to say this. They had been meeting together. These ministers had been meeting together for decades. They've been getting together in the association meeting every fall. It is very likely that those churches, that when John Parks couldn't let her in 1905, it's very possible, and when the other men were disfellowshipped that year, it's very possible that he got together with some of those like-minded men and said, well, let's have a meeting, let's have a revival, let's have a get-together of our own. It's very possible that they did that. It's very possible that in 1906, there was a meeting that took place that connected them, that was fellowship, that kept them in line. There is, however, no record of any organizational meeting that took place before August the 24th, 1907. And so that's where we're going to start. They may have had some kind of a quasi-associational meeting before that, or in 1906, but in August of 24th, 1907, there was a group of these ministers, and we don't have all their names listed, but we know some of the men that were at that meeting that met at Ryan's Creek, in that log house where the rooms had been torn out, and where the Ryan's Creek Church was meeting. There was a group of ministers that met, A.J. Silcox served as the chairman of that meeting. J.T. Richardson served as its clerk. And at that meeting, they appointed 2 committees. One of those committees was a committee on articles of faith. A.J. Silcox, John Bryant, not John Bryant, Stephen Bryant, doctrine, so that when we meet, we're going to meet in an associational meeting in October. Bring something with you that we can present and say, this is going to be our covenant, this is our doctrine, this is what our faith statement. They also, at that meeting, created a committee on constitutional name. What are we going to call ourselves? That committee consisted of John Parks, Alan Moses, John Smitty, and James and Isaac Jones, 2 brothers. And so they're going to come and propose it. What are we going to call ourselves in an association? And so that's what they did in August, and along with also appointing John Parks to preach the introductory sermon and some other matters of business that they took care of. So on October the 11th, 1907, at Little Wolf Creek, the first assembly of the Church of God Mountain Assembly met at Little Wolf Creek, Kentucky. And at that meeting, and let me say this, they also had another committee that prepared an order of proceedings. John Parks, Stephen Bryant, Alan Moses, they put together the list of this is what we're going to do, how we're going to accomplish it. Now, October 11, 1907, after singing, they elected A.J. Silcox to be the moderator. They elected J.J. Sammons to be the assistant moderator. J.T. Richardson was elected to be the clerk, and J.C. Taylor was elected to be the assistant clerk. They put together a resolution committee that consisted of Melvin Ross, Alan Moses again, and Kurt Walker. Question?
So the 1907 minute book that you had us read, is it recording the minutes from October 11th or the 20th?
Both.
Oh, okay.
The minutes of that meeting in August and the minutes of the meeting in October are both
in there.
in the first.
That's why it says the 2
Yes.
refers to.
Yes, they're in the same, and your homework is going to refer to those 2 meetings.
They were both assembly meetings in
The
1 year.
The first one was
August the 24th, 1907, they met to organize, to lay out, to construct committees that would prepare them for when they come to the assembly. You know what I mean? So that, for example, when we have our assembly now, we've had a year. You know, a program committee has been working on things. We come up. We have finance reports that we're approving. We've got a year's worth of stuff. You know, that we think of the assembly in some ways as the end of the calendar year. I mean, you know, then we start all over again. Well, when you have your first assembly, you don't have a year's worth of stuff to, you know, you have to start from scratch. And so instead of starting on October 11th from scratch with all the delegates present, there were a group of men that got together and met and said, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to come up with some articles of faith, and we're going to come up with a constitutional name, and you know, break. You know, and then we broke the huddle, and we met again in October of 1907 at Little Wolf Creek. And so the Committee on Resolutions presented 6 resolutions. I'm not going to read them. I'm not going to read them tonight just for the sake of time. And because you can read, and they're in the minutes. So check your jump drive and read them. But they read the resolutions, also adopted the articles of faith, and they left the meeting with the intention of meeting again at Zion Hill the following September. We're going to meet 1908 in Zion Hill. And the name that's used at the end of that meeting is, they called themselves the Holiness Union Association. Now the cover says Minutes of the Church of God, and so apparently there were 2 names that were given at first, and when Church of God became the standard over Holiness Union Association, we just don't know. There's just not primary source documentation to tell us. Now let me say, there are no printed minutes in 1908, 1909, and 1910. They printed a minute book the first year, but for some reason they did not print minutes the second, third, or fourth assembly. So there are 5 years in the history of the Mountain Assembly where there was no minute book printed. 1908, 1909, 1910, 1973, and 2000 for later on. But no minutes for those years. So all we can do is really conjecture. Now, Luther in his history book says that that 1908 assembly took place at Siler's Chapel. Luther doesn't have any sources, really don't know where that information came from, some oral history that was handed down. There was an early assembly at Siler's Chapel, but the minutes of the meeting in 1907 said we're going to meet at Zion Hill. Now, it's possible that they couldn't meet at Zion Hill for some reason, and they chose to meet at Siler's Chapel instead. On your jump drive, I have 3 documents, 1908, 1909, and 1910, that I call quasi-minute books. They're what a minute book might have looked like if one had been printed, one existed. Everything in there is conjecture, speculation, but sometimes the guesses are educated guesses, and so you can read what I've got actually inside the cover are just some tidbits, some facts, connecting the dots between 1907 and 1911. And so Luther again says that the meeting was held in 2009 at Siler's Chapel, and the meeting in 2010 in 1910 at Elk Valley, Tennessee. And so these are some of those, and then 1911 at Siler's Chapel. These are the first 5 assemblies. And 3 of them are probable locations. Don't know any of the details, records, churches that were involved, ministers that were involved, but the early years of it, sometime between 1907 and 1911, the Church of God Mountain Assembly became Pentecostal. Sometime during that time frame, we made the transition from holiness into Pentecostal. By the time the 1911 minutes are printed, there are references to the baptism of the Holy Ghost, there are references to divine healing, there are references to speaking in other tongues. So sometime in those years. Now, what I do know is that in 1909, Jonah Shelton received the baptism of the Holy Ghost and spoke with other tongues. So at least somebody that was associated with the Church of God Mountain Assembly had embraced Pentecostalism as early as 1909. When that happened, we really just don't know when we transitioned from holiness to Pentecostal. But by 1911, we were fully Pentecostal. We're talking about people. The First Assembly is important, and the events and things are important, but let's talk about people and these founding members. Let's look at 10 churches. 10 churches at this first meeting. We mentioned the Little Wolf Creek Church. This church was one of the churches that was excluded from the South Union Baptist Association. Little Wolf Creek Church is still in existence today. Today it's part of the Church of God, the original Mountain Assembly, has been since 1946. We'll talk more about that in a few more sessions. The Zion Hill Church is one of the churches that was excluded by the South Union Baptist Association in 1904. In 1916, they became a part of the Church of God General Assembly that we're going to talk about before we leave here. The Hayes Creek Church.
What?
Hayes Creek Church. I believe was part of the West Union Association, and by 1916 they became part of the General Assembly. The Lower Elk Valley Church is another one of those original churches. Lower Elk Valley Church is going to make the transition from up past Indian Mountain State Park. If you're going toward the park, turn left. Up that Lower Elk Valley is Upper Elk Valley. Of course, is what we call Elk Valley. But that region down there by the park is what was called Lower Elk Valley. In 1922, that church transitioned from there over to the Tabernacle, and then later on built on Main Street, and now they're back at the Tabernacle. That's the Jellicoe Church. So when you see references to the Lower Elk Valley Church in those first 15-minute books, you're talking about the Jellicoe Church. And I believe that the Lower Elk Valley Church was a remnant, or was the Good Hope Baptist Church that was excluded in 1906 from the South Union Baptist Association. One of those holiness split, 1946. Pleasant View, in Pleasant View, Kentucky. Again, another one of those splits. It's where it came from. And I'm not really sure what happened to them, but I think, and I got to go back and I got to do some digging into their pastor and where he ended up. But by 1921, they're not listed in the minute book anymore, and I think that they went into the Church of God. They became part of the Church of God in Cleveland. Ryan's Creek. We talked about that log house where the building was set in order that split off from the old Ryan's Creek Baptist Church. They moved a few miles up the road, built what at the time was an impressive church building at Jellicoe Creek. That church is still standing, and I'm not sure who's pastoring today at Jellicoe Creek, but the church is still in operation, still continuing to worship at Jellicoe Creek. Ryan's Church became Jellicoe Creek. Sheep Creek is another one of those splits. And in 1921, for reasons that the minutes don't go into, E.J. Roundtree was disfellowshipped with the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and so the church that he was pastoring at Sheep Creek at the time, they're no longer with us. In Saxton, Kentucky is another one of those original churches. 1946, they went with the original Mountain Assembly, and up until just a few years ago, they were still having church at Saxton. Somebody told me that somebody bought the building now and has made a residence out of it.
Now, the thing about Saxton Church is there's still a Saxton Baptist. Now, the old Saxton Church that was down there below Buck Creek where Euless resides at, it was actually, there was another Mountain Ash Church of God, Mountain Ash Church of God of the General Assembly. They bought the old Saxton building. Now it's Saxton Church of God of General Assembly. But it was vacant.
The church is still there?
Yes.
They're still, okay. Somebody told me they thought that they had,
No,
somebody moved into it, was living in it. But okay.
There's somebody living next to it, like there's a house close to it in that premises, but the church actually was run down, and you could tell it was not used for years.
Right.
And the guy that bought it, him and his family and congregants, they actually went in, redid the whole place up. It looks great from the outside, but I ain't seen the inside of it.
Yeah. I'm going to get back over there then and look, because there's a lot of history there. The other church is the Woldridge, Tennessee Church, and I don't know where it came from. I just know that again in 1921 it's not listed. I think that it went into the Church of God. We'll talk at some point about why I think in the 20s we had some churches and ministers that left, and so that may be part of it. 10 churches at that first assembly. There were 7 pastors. Did 3 churches not have pastors? No. Right? 3 churches are 2 pastors, or 1 pastor pastors 3 different guys pastored 2 different churches. I'll get that out in a minute. Who are these pastors? Thomas DeBerry Moses was pastoring the church at Little Wolf Creek. James Jackson Salmons is pastoring the church at Saxton. John Hansford Parks is pastoring the church at Pleasant View, and also the church of Zion Hill. They're not too far away from each other. Stephen Nathan Bryant is pastoring the church at Patterson Creek. Aaron Thomas is pastoring the church at Ryan's Creek. Newton K. Parks, John's brother, is pastoring at Hayes Creek. John P. Smitty is pastoring the church at Lower Elk Valley and also the church at Woldridge. And Sheep Creek has been pastored by Edom John Roundtree, E.J. Roundtree. These are the 7 pastors, original pastors, Church of God Mountain Assembly. There are 51 delegates. Now, this is my recollecting. If you count the names that are listed, some of the guys are listed more than one time, and sometimes names are misspelled and did the best they can. Sometimes there's typographical errors. There's a T.M. Thomas that's listed. I can't find anybody at all, any relation to that, anybody living in that area at that time period, any Thomas whose first name starts with the letter T. I can't find any. There's a strong possibility that he is also, that it's J.M. Thomas, who's listed in another place, Josiah Martin Thomas, that it's the same guy and it's a typo. We're trying to reconcile. I think that I have positively identified 49 of the 51, and I'm pretty sure who the other two are. But again, you're doing the work. You're doing the work of detective in a lot of cases. There are 51 delegates. At least 18 of them are ministers. Now, not all of them are ministers, but at least 18 of them are ministers. If you read the list of names, and the reason that sometimes they're listed as members of one church and 2 or 3 years later they're listed, sometimes you move coal mines, move around from one coal camp to the next, and so there were a lot of miners. There's at least one Civil War soldier, John Griffiths, and there may be 2. The average age of 19 years old, from age of having been in the same church, the same associations, sometimes they're even stronger than family ties. Let's talk about, again, developing identity. I want to talk about the role of nomenclature in developing identity. What's in a name? Nomenclature is the study of names and how those names develop. So let's talk about the evolution of a name. I mentioned that there is a reference to the Holiness Union Association in 1907 in our in that first minute book. It's called the Holiness Union Association, and also almost simultaneously, the title is the Minutes of the Churches of God. And I say Church of God, and it really should say Churches of God, because it's plural in 1907. Churches of God. Remember, the mindset is these are local autonomous churches that come together in association. So it's not one Church of God, it's Churches of God. There are 10 of them that come together. Church of God, between 1893 and 1900, there were 23 new denominations that arose out of the holiness movement in America. Many of them had headquarters in southeastern United States, and many of them used variations of the name Church of God. And that's just the 23 that sprang up in the last decade of the 19th century. And that's not counting all the numerous ones that sprang up in the first couple of decades afterwards. Church of God was a popular name because it was a Bible name. Had to be God. In 1911, the General Assembly was attended by A.J. Tomlinson and J.S. Llewellyn. Tomlinson and he also came in 1912. Tomlinson was the general overseer of the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. He came to the assembly in 1911. It's not a coincidence, perhaps, that in 1911, when they became aware that there was another group calling themselves the Church of God, that in order to distinguish themselves, separate themselves apart from that other group that was meeting in Cleveland, Tennessee, they added in 1911 the name Mountain Assembly. The minute says, on motion and second, that this assembly shall be called the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. One story that has been handed down since that time, the oral tradition that's been handed down, is that the men, when they were trying to figure out what are we going to call this assembly, what are we going to call this association meeting, they spent time in prayer and went up into the mountains to pray. And then when they came back, the 30 of them that came back, 32 of them or so that were there, when they came back, the story's not told that they all came back and at the same time opened their mouths and Church of God was spoken, but that they all came back and that the consensus was, they all felt that strong pull, we should call ourselves the Churches of God of the Mountain Assembly. Add the name Mountain Assembly to the name. I mentioned Tomlinson having been there. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. In 1917, on August the 2nd, 1917, the Church of God was incorporated in the state of Tennessee. Henry Mobley, Newt Parks, John Parks, J.O. Goins, and George Ford as trustees of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, signed an incorporation, and they chose the name Church of God as the name. Now I ask you, one of your homework questions is going to be about the name change, and I'm asking you, because here's the other perspective. What they were naming in 1911 was not an organization or a denomination as much as it was the meeting that took place in October. This is the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God, as opposed to the Cleveland Assembly or the White Plains Assembly or the Florida. I like the Hawaiian Assembly myself. But the name was incorporated in 1917 as Church of God. In 1943, the Church of God reincorporated as the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God, October 20th, 1943. "14 months later, they changed it again. Now, I wish that I knew the story behind it, but I don't. In 1944, they became the Church of God. In name. Now, you're not going to see that in the minute books. The minute books, there is going to be a transition that takes place in the 40s, where the minutes, they go from being the minutes of the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God to the minutes of the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly Incorporated. And so in 1947, April the 15th, 1947, the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly Incorporated was changed. That's been our name now for 70 years. Luther Gibson, J.H. Bryant, Ira Moses, Clayton Lawson, and R.N. Ballinger. I hope that his great-grandson is watching by now and can recognize that name. But they're the trustees acting on behalf of the assembly that changed the name of the assembly. Talk about, again, the importance of name in developing an identity. Who are you? I'm Church of God Mountain Assembly. And what that means. Let me talk about association with the Church of God. I mentioned that Tomlinson came in 1911 and came in 1912, made visits to the General Assembly. Now, if you've read anything at all about A.J. Tomlinson, then you know that A.J. Tomlinson is not the kind of guy to just come and observe and go to the house. That's not his nature. In 1911, you read the minutes, you'll find out A.J. Tomlinson was leading in prayer. He was reading church letters in the business session. He was helping to conduct elections. He was preaching, praying for the sick, and all. He was being A.J. Tomlinson. That was his personality. Take charge, get involved. He wrote in his diary on October the 9th, 1911, he wrote, "Just arrived home from Kentucky, where I was for 3 days in an assembly of the churches, preached 2 sermons, beside other talks and interpretations of messages in tongues, had a good time, pleasant fellowship with the precious people in their assembly. See further particulars of the meeting in the Evangel of October 15th, 1911, which unfortunately has not been located. Nobody has a copy of it. He said, gave some messages and interpretations while under the power. The people saw the fire as it was above my head and about me. The people were so wonderfully blessed that they asked the Lord to enlarge them and make them able to ensure the blessings God was favoring them with." The following year, on the same day, October 9th, 1912, he wrote in his diary, went to Jellicoe, Tennessee, preached there at night, was in the Mountain Assembly, which convened a mile out from Jellicoe. I preached at the assembly Saturday night at Newcomb, Tennessee. Sunday at the assembly, I was in the congregation, and after Brother Parks finished his discourse on the platform, he called for me, and I went up and preached for an hour and a half or more after he had preached an hour and 5 minutes. A great crowd, estimated at 1,500. The seats were taken out of the house and placed outdoors in front of the house, and 1,000 people stood up while we preached. We had to stand on a platform in the hot sun, and most of the congregation was in the hot sun most of the time. But they stayed right there, and God wonderfully helped a number for healing right out in the hot sun. It's like a modern mission trip, don't it? Remarkable account. 1912, Church of God Mountain Assembly sent messengers to Cleveland, Tennessee to the General Assembly of the Church of God. We sent messengers to Cleveland, Tennessee, in the same manner that we had, we talked about the association meetings in the South Union Baptist Association. Members from the West Union Association would come. Members from the Mount Zion Association would come. And we would send messengers to them. And so the idea of the associational meeting model was still in the minds of our people. And we sent letters corresponding with the ministers there. And there was talk in the delegation floor that day. Let me read to you from the minutes. They're in your jump drive, so you can also look at them. But and their minutes are quite a bit longer than ours, so I encourage you to use the find, Control F, and search for the things that you're looking for. But the general overseer spoke of his visit to the Mountain Assembly in Eastern Kentucky. This is January 9th, 1912. He spoke of his visit in October to the General Assembly and how that they had offered themselves to the General Assembly of the Churches of God and appointed messengers to attend this assembly for the purpose of forming a union. He then introduced John H. Parks of Inland, Kentucky, who spoke about the Kentucky work, how that they had seen the light and that a number of them had been excluded from the Baptist church. He then spoke of the growth of the work and how finally they had called themselves the Church of God. And that when they had heard of the General Assembly and its work, they desired to connect themselves with it and that they had come for that purpose. Stephen Bryant was also called to the stand and gave an interesting talk corroborating the statement of Mr. Parks. A committee was appointed to confer with the Kentucky Brethren about union. So 4 days later, the committee that was appointed read their letter, their report that was accepted. This is what it says. The General Assembly of the Churches of God held January 9th through the 14th, 1912 at Cleveland, Tennessee, to the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. Greetings in the name of Jesus, our great lawgiver. Your kind greetings by letter and in person at the hands of your honorable representatives or messengers, John Parks, Stephen Bryant, Jonas Shelton, William Hicks, and J.M. Thomas, are received with gratitude and appreciation unanimously. And your worthy messengers are granted a place with us in our assembly. In spirit, they are received at once. In conference, we, the General Assembly of the Churches of God, have arranged as a basis of union the following to it. First, that we receive your assembly as a whole. Second, that we receive those of your ministers and deacons in their respective positions who are free from the use of tobacco and have the experience of the baptism with the Holy Ghost evidenced by speaking in other tongues as the Spirit gave utterance, and but one living wife. That your ministers receive credentials from the Church of God. You may continue to have your assembly, but recognize the General Assembly as supreme. Recognize the state overseers for the Kentucky and Tennessee Assembly as they will be able to assist you in whatever needs you may have. Now, Charles W. Kahn, one of the first historians for the Church of God, writes in his book, Like a Mighty Army, and he mentions this very briefly in passing, and in footnote he says, this failed when the Mountain Assembly declined the proposition set forth by the Church of God. And so we see that there was at least an attempt early on with the Church of God Mountain Assembly to participate with, to join into, and to form a union with the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. But we know that it did not happen. Now, I want to say this. We once, one more time, had a resolution that we send to receive our letter and our messengers, and sent again another group of men. Now, question. Now, in my book, my first of why it didn't happen, and I'm going to offer them to you tonight. One of them has been revised a little bit, and then I'm going to add to it two more. So here they are, reasons why this merger with the Church of God never took place. First of all, and there are theories, and I think probably the truth is, if you take all four of the theories and combine them together, you probably come up with a reason. So it's probably a little bit of all of them. Number one is an incompatible ecclesiology. And with it, differing expectations. That is, when I read what Charles Kahn says in his footnote, when it looks like on the surface that what happened was that the Church of God in Cleveland said, these are the conditions under which we will consider a merger with you, sent them back to the General Assembly and went and in Jellicoe, Tennessee, or Saxton or wherever they were meeting that particular year, that they decided, you know what, that is not what we had in mind. And so different expectations and with it differing ecclesiologies. Now I've talked about, I mentioned in the first session tonight, session number 3, I mentioned the fact that if you don't understand anything else during the course of this class, you have to understand this concept. That the concept of local church autonomy was ingrained in the Baptist roots of our men. Every church has the right to speak for itself in all matters. So the condition, now let me stop just a second and say that the ecclesiology of the Church of God in Cleveland is altogether different. That is not the mentality of the Church of God. And the Church of God, when you join the Church of God, you join the Church of God with headquarters in Cleveland, Tennessee. You are a part of the organization and have access to the General Assembly when it comes time to convene in regular business session. You're a part of that bigger body. A.J. Tomlinson's vision for the church, his understanding of ecclesiology, was on that Roman Catholic model of the hierarchy of bishops and overseers. And in the same way that in the Catholic Church, we call them districts and district overseers. And Tomlinson, in his vision of the church, was that for all intents and purposes, he was the Pope of the true church. The church of God. And that there were overseers that were under him and those local churches. That in the Church of God, the ecclesiology of the Church of God is such that overseers have the power to appoint pastors. And sometimes, you hear all kinds of horror stories from local churches in our area especially about overseers coming in and removing pastors, putting other guys in and stuff like that. That mentality never existed in the Mountain Assembly. And so part of the reason that merger could not, one of the conditions was, we receive your assembly as a whole. Well, here's 5 men that went to Cleveland, Tennessee. They might have represented 5 churches, but they didn't represent all 12 or 13. I can't speak. Some of those men said, I can't even speak for the church I pastor. That I'm just going to accept I've got to let my church vote on this. And they certainly couldn't, they certainly couldn't speak for a church on the other side of the county to which they had no connection whatsoever. And so part of it was just the difference in ecclesiology from the very beginning that complicated things. Now, Tomlinson, apparently in the 1930s, there was a rumor that persisted that at one time John Parks and Stephen Bryant had given the Mountain Assembly over to the Church of God. And so Parks wrote a letter to A.J. Tomlinson asking just, for if he could shed some light to help quell this rumor. And it's actually printed in our 1934 minute book. But Tomlinson wrote him back and said, I just read your letter and have given attention to the matter. I'm still not able to find where these minutes say that Brother Bryant and yourself delivered the Mountain Assembly over to the Cleveland General Assembly. I admit that the names of John Parks, Stephen Bryant, Jonas Sheldon, William Hicks, and J.M. Thomas are given, but I remember very well that yourself and Brother Bryant did leave, and we only acted by what the other 3 brethren said. From the very fact that we never did work together according to the plans outlined is enough to show that the matter of union was not finally decided upon, and we never did recognize its final consummation. And so that's part of the explanation that Tomlinson gives. And so I think that's part of the answer. A second reason is that at the time, 1912, 13, 14, 15, the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee taught against members of the Church of God belonging to secret societies and labor unions. So the church members were not allowed to be members of secret societies. You couldn't belong to the lodge. You couldn't be a Mason. You couldn't be an Elks Club member, and you could not belong to a union. Now, the idea, from what I understand, is the fact that if your allegiance is to them, that they would claim your allegiance over you. Your ultimate allegiance ought to be to the church. You shouldn't put yourself in a position to have divided loyalties. And And the idea is if you belong to the union, the labor union, they own you. And so the question was asked in 1912 at the General Assembly, can anyone belonging to the United Coal Miners Association be received in the Church of God? The answer, no. You couldn't belong to the United Mine Workers Association and be a member of the church. Now, does anybody see any problems that this might cause in southeastern Kentucky where our churches were located? Now, a year later, they softened this stand, and they actually changed their policy. And they said that members are allowed to pay union dues for the right to work in the mines. So you can technically join the union, pay your union dues, but if you're a member of the church, you should not participate in union meetings. So you could belong in order to be able to, because some mines were union owned, you couldn't work at all if you weren't part of the union. And so, but with that caveat, that was for lay members, they added to that because ministers were expected to be examples, the Church of God would still not license or ordain any minister who had any connections to the union. Now, I know that this is a subject that requires more study, more research than what I have presently done. I don't know. I know that we have members and ministers who were parts that were working in coal mines. I know that. I'm sure that some of them were union members. I'm sure. That's a project for more research. If I was a professor at the university and this is my field of specialty, my graduate assistants would have already done this research and helped me publish a paper and been famous because of it. But so I don't have those exact numbers. On the role of Church of God members, Church of God ministers, and the union in Harlan County, Kentucky. It's a fascinating story. She heard about my book and what I said. We want to pursue this a little. Here's the third thing. Minutes and what they actually said. With several factors. One of those is as long as none of them has more than one living wife. Now, again, I don't know the numbers, don't know the stats. This is a theory thrown out there, requires more research. My guess is there was probably somebody in the Church of God Mountain Assembly at the time who had been married and divorced and remarried, and then later on got saved, sanctified, filled with the Holy Ghost, started preaching, became a minister in the church. My guess is there was probably somebody that this case applied to. It was at least prevalent enough in society and in the church culture. It was at least prevalent enough that the Church of God had to throw it out there. They either dealt with it themselves within their own denomination and just wanted to, and maybe it had something ugly that they had happen and deal with it, and so they wanted to nip it in the bud. But again, maybe that's another reason. And then the fourth thing, the other specification in the minutes was they have to be free from the use of tobacco. Why 19 and this question was on somebody's mind shortly after this encounter with the Church of God, and the same thing is true with the issue of tobacco. In 1911, at the General Assembly, the Church of God Mountain Assembly, we changed our name, Mountain Assembly, but we also, that same year, on a motion and second, that the churches of God ordain no minister that will not abstain from the use of tobacco and other filthy habits. And the question was asked, what should we do with those brethren that now use? The answer was, advise them to quit. And after a long discussion by both sides, which lasted in the evening with much interesting remarks made against the use of tobacco, with many sobs, groans, amens, and shouts and prayers to God for victory, the moderator declared the discussion closed, and the vote on the amendment, which resulted in 15 votes in favor of the use of tobacco and 18 against the use of tobacco. 15 in favor and 18 against. Now, this is an issue, obviously, that I can say there were some ministers in the Church of God Mountain Assembly that were affected by the tobacco question. Now, the question is, can you, if you've got some ministers who just cannot get comfortable with the idea of going into an organization and placing themselves under the authority, placing their church under the authority of an overseer who's disconnected, who's not a part of it, I'm accountable and he's going to make decisions based on what's going to church. It's going to take my paper, my credentials over the issue of divorce and remarriage. I can't join an organization that tells me I got to quit using my tobacco in order to keep my license. So here's several issues that were at hand that are at least somewhat responsible for the merger that never took place. While we're on the subject of tobacco, let me say that motion was made in 1911, but and the vote was taken and the vote was close. Well, the 1911 Assembly was divided, 18 to 15, divided on the issue of tobacco. Now, how do you think that vote, 18 to 15, how do you think that vote went over? The next two resolutions might give us a glimpse of how it went over. The next resolution they passed, be it resolved that the withdrawn members from the Church of God be reconciled to their church or keep silent in the churches of God. The next resolution, be it resolved that we leaders do not abruptly leave the house without permission. So you can about guess how that went over. That issue persisted over the next several years. In 1913, they did not advocate the use of tobacco in any way. Furthermore, be it resolved that preachers or any members of the churches that use tobacco then claim that the Lord took the taste away, or that He spoke some way and told them to quit its use and then go back to using it again, that their church compare charges against such members. And so there's some inconsistency in the subject. 1915, there was a motion and a second that this assembly withdraw its fellowship from every preaching brother that will not abstain totally from the use of tobacco from this time on, and furthermore it is advised that the members of the churches that will not uphold this resolution, that their church see after them. And they also voted that year to appoint ministers to go to the churches where those brethren use tobacco, and have the preachers who are pastoring, who are using tobacco, that they go to and see about them. So E.J. Roundtree went to Zion Hill, where W.R. Hamlin was pastor. Hamlin was pastoring at Zion Hill and at Rock Creek. And Kurt Walker and Lewis Broyles were sent to Hayes Creek, where E.L. Lovett was pastoring. And the council of the assembly was rejected. And so in 1918, it was moved and approved by the assembly that we exclude from the assembly the following churches: Zion Hill, Hayes Creek, and Rock Creek, for refusing to accept the counsel of this assembly, and we hereby notify them not to use the date of our organization, which was August 24th, 1907, nor the name of our assembly, nor the time of our annual meeting, which is the first Friday after and Saturday in October each year. So we not only told them you're kicked out, but we told them you can't use our name, you can't use our organization date, and you can't even meet the same time of year that we meet. Those churches, by the way, formed the General Assembly of the Church of God, and the ones that were excluded, they formed the General Assembly of the Church of God. It's current. I don't know how many churches are part of the fellowship now. It's not large, but their tabernacle, their headquarters is still the church at Pine Knot in Pine Knot, Kentucky. East Pine Knot Tabernacle Church of God, I think, is the name of it. And the church at Hayes Creek is still going strong. It's one of our first churches, and it's still going strong. Still got some old members in it.
It was associated because their approval of tobacco use.
Yes, yeah. For
It was
tobacco use.
One churches.
Zion Hill, Hayes Creek, and Rock Creek.
And this is all over the form of the General Assembly.
The General Assembly of the Church of God was formed over the issue of tobacco.
So anybody that we see today as Church of God General Assembly, that's what it is. They basically.
That's their now where they're at now, where they're staying on the issue and this that. I don't know what.
Right.
But that's their history.
But that's where they
came out of that. Yeah, came out of that group. Now it also there are churches that are in existence today that obviously weren't. You know, they're not the ones that W.R. Hamlin's dead. You know, E.O. Lovett is dead. And so there are other churches that have been. I know there was a General Assembly church over in Frakes for a long time. Otis and CB and Hiram Ellis's brother Joseph pastored that church for years. CB begged Joseph to come into the Mountain Assembly, begged him to come, be part of the Mountain Assembly, quick, but he never would. And they're holding his people. Joseph Ellis wouldn't have a television in his home. Now they're holding his people, but couldn't get past the use of tobacco. And so, and I don't know, again, I don't know what the particular dynamic is with that now. But here's another interesting tidbit. 1925, moved in order that we do not receive members into our body that are baptized by excluded members, such as W.R. Hamlin, etc., until they are legally baptized by ordained ministers. So we wouldn't even bring somebody into our churches that had been baptized by Hamlin. Let's talk about the Church of God Union Assembly. The General Assembly is not the only group that came out of the Mountain Assembly. Let's talk about the Union Assembly real quickly. Charlie T. Pratt was ordained at Goldbug in 1910. The following year, that church lettered in to the Mountain Assembly as a brand new church. He attended his first assembly in 1912. About the same time, he held a tent revival in Bartow County, Georgia, and a church was started as a result of that at Cass Station, Georgia, in Bartow County. In 1913, he lettered in from Cass Station, brought his church in by letter to the Mountain Assembly. He disappears from the record by 1914. He had been disfellowshipped for conduct unbecoming of a minister. And also the claim of unorthodox eschatology. Basically, Pratt said he had a vision, and in that vision he saw the devil in chains. And so he began to preach that we were living in the millennial reign, that Satan is bound right now. And so sometimes the Union Assembly is called the devil-bound organization. That's not a flattering title, but that's kind of something that gets thrown at them. But his and they met in 1916 on Christmas Day, and the Church of God Union Assembly was a result of that. Now, it's not a coincidence that in 1917, when the Church of God Mountain Assembly adopted its first articles of faith, that the last thing on the list was so it caused us to take a stand on doctrine. Let's talk about the supernatural. Talk about identity. The use of miracles in developing identity. And manifest. Who are you? Who are you? We're the church that believes in miracles. The stories told, probably the most famous story in the history of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Persecution against the church in some circles was now the South Union Baptist Association's official response was, we are sorry that our brethren have left, and we recommend that you do not persecute them. But those that were outside the church, the holiness folks were open. They were subject to ridicule. Holy rollers was a derogatory term that was thrown at them, and it was not uncommon to have rocks pelted through the windows. And I've heard stories of snakes being thrown, poisonous snakes being thrown in. The door opened up and just slid across the floor, and cars being vandalized in the parking lot, things like that. The ultimate climax of persecution took place one night, perhaps at the old Hackler Church at Lower Oak Valley, when a group of men, 3 men, brought weapons to the meeting that night for the purpose of breaking up the service. They were threatening the pastor with violence, threatening his life, But God intervened that night, and John Parks was lifted up by the power of the Holy Spirit off of the stage, lifted up until the eyewitnesses say his back touched the ceiling. His wife Rachel cried out, "Oh no, Lord, not now," thinking that God was calling him home. The sight was enough to deter those men, to stop them in their progress. And they left, and Betty Hammett was an eyewitness. She was a teenager there at the time. She would tell the story. She named the men by name. And she said that one of those men lost his ability to speak. He never could talk about it. He never could. It so affected him, he never could talk again. Another man lost his mind, went insane, and a third man killed himself. It made an impact on those that were there. People would testify of that story for some time. For some time after that, Daniel Moses was there at the meeting, sitting on the stage. When John Parks was lifted up, I said Daniel Moses. Those that went to church with him in Jellicoe would have called him Daniel. Daniel Moses would testify about it, and he would talk about how that he would tell that story with such passion. And he was sitting up there on the stand. He said, "And when he came down, he put his hand on my shoulder." Johnny Douglas said, "You'd have thought Jesus Christ touched that man." I mean, the Lord himself was, but that was the reverence that they had for him and the respect for the moment. John Parks couldn't talk about it. He told me for years after that experience, he couldn't talk. He said, "Anytime I talk about it or think about it," he said, "I feel myself being pulled." So what an incredible moment in the history of our organization. Divine healings were prevalent. 1913, the question was asked about the gift of healing in the name of the Lord, and there were many diverse healings that took place. One of the early healings was that of S.N. Bryant's wife, Mary Davenport Bryant, had been sick for so long that she didn't have the strength to turn herself in the bed. And one day, 3 different doctors examined her and told Stephen Bryant, said, "You're just wasting your time and money on doctors." He said that your wife has just 3 or 4 days to live at the very most. Sister Bryant refused to take her medicine that evening, and they called the church together. Some of the church people came together that night. They ate supper, they sang songs, and they prayed. They laid hands on Sister Bryant, prayed for healing, and she raised herself up from the bed that night and said, "I'm healed." She got dressed and ate a good supper, and the doctors came in the next morning. They knew that something had happened, something supernatural had taken place. At 1915 assembly at Jellicoe Creek, Sister Shelton from Black Mountain, North Carolina, was sick with pellagra. She sent a pair of gloves to the assembly to be anointed and prayed over, and then they were mailed to her. When she put those gloves on her hands, she was healed immediately. October the 4th, 1919, at Elk Valley, Sister Rosa Enix had been deaf for some time, and she was healed instantly and could hear from as well as anyone. At the 1928 assembly, John Meeks, who had been a messenger from the Lower Elk Valley Church 12 years earlier, was in the asylum. 12 years earlier, was in the asylum. Had lost his mind, but prayer was offered for him at the assembly, and God delivered him and brought him out. James, you ever hear him testify?
Sure.
Tell his story. Amen. He was a deacon at the Fondue Church after that, and then at Middlesboro for many years after that. God delivered him and set him free. Just so many of those examples of the manifestation of God's power, and maybe one of the greatest examples of healing and God's power wasn't so much a healing as it was of protection. That in those years shortly after World War I, when all of our soldiers were coming back from these foreign places where they'd never been before, they brought back all kinds of sickness and disease. And at the close of World War I, the great pandemic of influenza swept across the United States and virtually the world. And during that flu of 1918 and 19, over 500,000 people died in the United States. During the 3rd week of October 1918, 4,600 people died in the city of Philadelphia alone. In all, between 21 and 22 million people died in the world. And in those days, the assembly, they would send their obituaries in to be printed in the assembly, and there was not one report of anybody that died of a flu-related death in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. God kept His hand of protection on His people, defined by the supernatural. Statements of faith. Let's talk about the role of doctrine in developing identity. 1907, the first articles, I mentioned the committee just a little bit ago, the first articles of faith of the Church of God Mountain Assembly were adopted by the organization. Six of them. Let me just throw, I'm not going to read them all, let me just throw the principles at you. One was sola scriptura. We talked about that, Martin Luther and Reformation. It's all about the fact that it's the Bible. The Bible is our foundation. The second was about regeneration by repentance and faith. It takes repentance and faith in order to be saved. The third was baptism by immersion in the Trinitarian formula. The fourth was on the doctrine of entire sanctification. The fifth was on apostasy. We teach the possibility of final apostasy of even the saints. And the sixth was on the doctrine of open communion. We believe all regenerated persons should be admitted to the Lord's table, and that people should examine themselves, and so eat and drink. In 1913, the first teachings of the Church of God Mountain Assembly are presented. You have the minute books on your jump drive, so I'm going to encourage you to take a look and see what kinds of things are mentioned.
What was the fifth article? You passed that.
The fifth article was apostasy, the danger of falling away. You can backslide and go to hell. 1917, there was another. I took those articles of faith that appeared in 1907. They don't show up again. They're not printed every year. In 1917, we printed a list of articles of faith. We adopted another set of articles of faith. There's 10 of them this time, a little longer, a little more in depth. They're going to be built upon. By 1920, we have teachings that are listed, and from 1920 until the present time, the teachings of the Church of God Mountain Assembly have been printed. The standard teachings of the Church of God Mountain Assembly have been printed in our minute book. They've been modified from time to time since then. Been some changes. The Declaration of Faith is printed now annually in our bylaws since the year 2000. And so these doctrinal statements of teachings and articles of faith, they serve as an example of who we are, helping to define us, defined by our doctrine. And then the last subject is permanent home. And look at the role of geography in developing an identity. The first step in the transition from association to denomination. The first step, and it didn't happen in 1922. The total picture didn't happen. The total transition didn't take place. But the first step toward that took place in 1922 with the establishment of a headquarters. And so I want to talk about from tabernacle to temple. And when I'm using those terms in the Old Testament sense, a tabernacle as a tent where the meeting is moved from place to place, and temple as a permanent location for God's dwelling. Now, I'm talking about the General Assembly, and not maybe, not the glory of God or what have you. But the first 15 assemblies moved around from Little Wolf Creek to Hayes Creek to Siler's Chapel, Elk Valley to Siler's Chapel, Lower Elk Valley, Saxton, Elk Valley, Jellicoe Creek, Lower Elk Valley, Emlyn, Lower Elk Valley, and Lower Elk Valley. Now, you can tell there was a trend that was taking place. The first 14 assemblies are at 18 different locations. 5 of those 8 locations are Lower Elk Valley. Half of the assemblies were held at Lower Elk Valley. And so it was looking more and more like this is the direction that we're going to go. However, in 1920, at an elders meeting, on October the 29th, 1920, just a few weeks after the General Assembly, the elders were asked to get together and to discuss this subject about having a permanent meeting place. And the elder board, the house is called to order by John Parks, chairman of the elder board. And it was moved to buy a parcel of land on a certain lot in the city of Williamsburg, Kentucky, on which to build a house for the Mountain Assembly. And at that meeting, they appointed trustees to handle the property, and they appointed a building committee for the purpose of constructing a tabernacle, a meeting house in Williamsburg, Kentucky. In 1921, they came to the General Assembly, and it was in Lower Elk Valley. They didn't. The plans to build, the plans to buy the property fell through, and they weren't able to do it. And so in 1921, the motion was made, the reference was made that last year we had a good time at the assembly, God blessed, and we had a great time, but we didn't have room for everybody that needed to be there. And so we have decided to build a tabernacle for next year, and the lot is now bought in the city of Jellicoe and staked off and ready to build. We've got a fine lot, it's in town, so all we need now is money. And so the call went out to send your money in so that we can get this building built before the next General Assembly. And so in 1922, the assembly was held in Jellicoe on Florence Avenue. Close to where the tabernacle on that property, on property that's owned by the Mountain Assembly now. That first tabernacle was built in 1922. The building was massive by today's standards. It had a balcony that wrapped all the way around the top of it. You could get up in the upstairs and go all the way around the top. Earl Pruitt talked about being a kid and getting loose from his mom and dad and going up there and you could stand up over the top of the preacher. He said, I remember watching John Parks with his magnifying glass, reading his Bible, and preaching, and the crowd being stirred, watching it as just a little boy. And so that's the image. Now there's some pictures of it in Luther's history book. There's some pictures of that the first tabernacle built in 1922. That year, the building was turned over to the Lower Elk Valley Church. And they moved from the Hackler Church, the old church building, up near where the cemetery is at now, and moved over to Florence Avenue and took over the tabernacle and moved their congregation into it. Now, every year at the end of the assembly, they would vote on where we're going to have the assembly at next year. Next year we're going to have it at Saxton. Next year we're going to have it in Emily. Next year we're going to have it at Lower Elk Valley. Next year we're going to come back to Lower Elk Valley. Next year we're going to come back to Lower Elk Valley. In 1922, when they built that tabernacle, they stopped voting every year on where they were going to have the assembly. Until 1949. And in 1949, they said, let's start having the assembly in different places. They voted and passed a measure, we're going to have the assembly in different places. They said, let's have the assembly next year in Cincinnati. And so they had the assembly in Cincinnati in 1950. And at the end of the assembly, they said, let's have the assembly next year in Jellicoe. And at the end of that assembly, they said, let's have the assembly next year in Jellicoe. And at the end of that assembly, they said, let's have the assembly next year in Jellicoe. And so they voted every year to have it in Jellicoe until in the 1960s, they bought the adjoining piece of property that was owned by the Jellicoe school system, where the old Jellicoe High School was, or the old Jellicoe Middle School. They bought the adjoining property, and they said, let's build a bigger tabernacle. This was the third tabernacle on the property. They built this, we'll talk about the second one later on. But the idea was that they didn't have to vote anymore once they knew where home was. And so home is there, and since that time, Jellicoe has been defined by the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and maybe in some ways the Church of God Mountain Assembly has been somewhat identified or defined by Jellicoe. Anybody got any questions tonight? I know I'm throwing so little time. Anybody? Questions, comments?
Do you think the sense of home, as far as the comical churches, is lost out of the assembly's not held?
I do. I think so.
Because, like I know where home office is.
Yeah.
But probably not any of my members do.
I think so. Because you lose that sense of home, and I've said tonight that home has played a part in developing identity, and I think all of us wherever it is we call home, there's a sense of who we are that's a product of the home we were raised in, that home of my childhood or my hometown or the school that I went to or whatever. I think that there is that sense of our identity being tied to the historical connections that are there. And so I think the organization experiences that as well. And there's a disconnect from the history. There's no history, for example, in Pigeon Forge and, in a conference room. I've never been a fan of the conference room. It's not an atmosphere that's conducive to worship most of the time. It's not like being in a church building. And so, because of that, I think there's something that's missing. It's hard to, maybe there's ways to replace it or substitute for it. But I never going to Jellicoe. I mean, never making a trip. And we were there for the revival that they had a few months ago or what have you, and I had the mission booklets that I had printed from Brother Walden. I carried them over to the office. That's the first time I've been in the office in a while. And I had a few guys with me that night that had never been inside the headquarters office building. That, it's like, come on guys, let's go over there. They'd never been inside the building. And, the pictures that are on the wall and, there's a lot of history that's there. And, to be disassociated with it, I think you lose some of your identity because, there's a story that's there. The monument, the deceased minister's memorial, there's nothing that, and I honestly, we update that annually and add the new names of the men who have died. But when they do that, don't have, nobody ever knows. I mean, you go there from year to year and see, well, that name wasn't there last time I saw it or whatever. There ought to at least be a memorial service. Something, when those names are put on there just a few days later, some of us get together and, just stand around the monument. If we don't, and maybe there's only a handful of people that would come, but to do something that connects us again with Jellicoe, I think is important historically. Even if you never attended an assembly in Jellicoe, there's something there to be learned by being there. The tabernacle's altogether different. It's a whole different configuration. What they've done to remodel it, it's not the same. But at the same time, it's the place.
When did they remodel?
New members and old members have lost. Old members lost the identity because of moving from Jellicoe. And I'm not complaining about anything. I'm just talking after old members.
Yeah.
But what I want, if it's all right, I'd like to say something about John Meeks.
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
John Meeks being healed from being in insane asylum. Later, John Meeks was crushed in coal mines, and he never walked again. The man never took an aspirin. He asked for prayer all the time. He never took any medicine. I used to haul him to church. I would go get him at his home, and he would get out of his wheelchair and scoot. He could do that. He could scoot. He'd scoot to the front porch and over to the edge of the porch. I'd park as close as I could get to it, and he could swing himself over in the car. And different brothers at the Middlesboro Church carried him in a chair up the high steps, which most of you have never even seen, for years and years and years. And he not only couldn't he talk, his face, he got mashed real good, and his face and nose got mashed up, and he couldn't, a lot of people couldn't understand his speech after that either. When he talked as my Kent, and he praised the Lord for everything, and his healing, never quit praising the Lord for that.
And to be connected, he was an old man, obviously, or sure seemed like he was an old man. But this is the guy that was at the General Assembly in 1916. And still around and connected to our churches for a long, long time after that. Gary, did you have a?
Yeah, you said something about the tabernacle being remodeled. When did they do that?
The Jellicoe Church
Yeah.
remodeled the tabernacle, the year that they moved in. 2006 maybe?
I was gonna say, because I was there when they had the assembly in 2005. You was actually preached one morning and we went. And so I remember what it looked like then, but I ain't been
When the
since.
stage was on the other side of the,
Like where the parking lot is in the front, where you walked in those glass doors, the stage, like if you walked in the doors here, the stage would have been up here to your right, is where it was when I went.
yeah, the stage was on the back side of where the piece of property that joins the Cantrell property, and behind it, the stage was on that side, and it had been remodeled several times by the assembly, and in fact, that's probably something we ought to do too. At some point in time, I'll bring in some video footage from some of the past assemblies. The old stage kind of had a box look and had, and then they changed it and they rounded it and, really, beautified it. Instead of having to walk over to the real narrow steps, they only had two sides of the stage. It was the only place you could get up on the stage. And then they rounded it, you could come up from any direction. But then the Jellicoe Church totally flipped it around the other side and put the stage on the other side of the building. So there's been it's a whole different building now than what it was, than what it used to be. And
That's what I've heard, is that it's completely different than what it was.
and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And in the old days when it was an open air tabernacle, August was not, it's not always a great time to be in a church service wearing a suit when the, temperature, it could get unbearable in there, but that's at the same time, if you didn't know that experience, if you didn't know what it was like to have insulation falling on you in the middle of church, or maybe see a sleeping bat, on the side, you just, you missed it. We can't do that anymore. So, guys, I apologize for talking so long tonight. That was not at all my intention, but at the same time, what would you